briefly, but if you have questions or relatively succinctly, directly, and quickly, but if you have questions as I'm moving along, please don't hesitate to ask them. I'll address them as we're going, or perhaps at the end. So first and foremost, can you see my slides, Madison, and can you hear me? And a thumbs up would be great.
Yes, we are good to go.
All right, very good. So we're going to talk about secondary trauma today. What is it, and how do we overcome it? And in order to do so, we really have to first talk about primary trauma. We have to talk about trauma proper. So whenever we say, I'm just going to jump right in, and trust everyone, or almost everyone's here. So whenever we say that someone has trauma, we're really identifying, or we're really referring to two phenomena that have been endured or experienced by that one person. And that means what? That means either some kind of experience of exposure to an event or something like an event, and some kind of experience of symptoms or post-event consequences that are affecting that person. So we want to understand what are exposure experiences that constitute a trauma. We hear this word a lot these days, trauma. So let's develop a shared understanding. And what are symptom presentations that constitute post-traumatic consequences or symptoms. So the first place we're going to turn is to the Mental Health Services Bible, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, edition number 5, which came out in 2013, I think it was. And it defines trauma under its definition or symptom criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder as the following. It is either actual or threat of death, serious physical injury, or sexual violence. And I can experience any one of these 3 different types of potential traumatic events in one of 4 different modalities, or one of 4 different ways. So if I can experience it directly, for instance, as a victim of a violent crime, my life was threatened perhaps, or I experienced sexual violence, or I was physically injured. So I can experience it directly. I can witness it happening in my immediate environment, and that constitutes a potential trauma for me. A potential traumatic event is what we call them. I can learn about it happening to someone that I love. I care about them so much that if something terrible happens to them, it's almost as if it just as well as it happened to me. Or the 4th different modality is what we're going to kind of focus on at the end of our time together, or middle to end of our time together. Secondary exposure, meaning that when I'm working with someone as a direct practitioner, frontline worker, what have you, and that person has been exposed to a lot of adversity and trauma, I am at risk for developing, my own experiences of post-trauma stress, whatever that's going to look like, post-trauma reactions. And we'll talk about that. We'll land on that later in our time together today. So there are various examples, of these different types of traumatic events that fall underneath the DSM definition or definitional boundaries: childhood abuse, intimate partner violence, or witnessing intimate partner violence, as unfortunately many children do. That's a potential trauma. Being a victim of a violent crime, witnessing it, hear about it happening to a loved one of mine, having someone that I work with experience that, being in a car accident, etc. These are hallmark examples, if you will, of potential traumatic events that fall within this definitional boundary advanced by the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Now, what are the problems with this definition? This is not a rhetorical question. I'm curious if anybody is concerned that this definition of trauma is problematic, too constrictive, potentially, and if so, why? Any thoughts? I know you've all turned your cameras off, so it's a little easier to be. Oh, yes, please. Who's raising her hand?
I am. I don't see anything here about when you talk about violence in terms of relationships. There is physical violence, and there is also, I don't know what they call it, mental violence.
Yes. What is your name?
Catherine.
Catherine.
Yeah.
Catherine, spot on. One of the big problems with this definition is it focuses solely on physical experiences and not emotional experiences. So can't coercive relationships, coercive intimate relationships that might not be physically violent but are emotionally harmful, can't that rise to the level of trauma? Sure. Can't emotional abuse of a child rise to the level of trauma? Sure. Can't other experiences that are emotionally harmful, like homelessness, say, can't that rise to the level of trauma? Of course. So it's focused solely on physical or sexual experiences and not so much on emotional experiences. That's one problem. Thank you, Catherine. Beautiful. Anything else? There are two other real significant issues with this definition, so many of us feel.
We also have a comment from Bill in the chat asking, what about generational violence?
So Bill brings up an excellent point. Is that Bill G that asked that question?
Correct.
It was. Excellent. Thank you, Bill. That's a beautiful question. And it starts to point toward not just events that are problematic, but how about situations or conditions that are problematic, like historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, like being exposed to extreme poverty, maybe being exposed to extensive racism stress over a certain period of time. These experiences mimic, at least in terms of their consequences, the experiences of acute trauma, these more chronic experiences of trauma. So this is another problem with this definition that Bill highlights. Excellent. Thank you, Bill. Does that make sense, what I said in response, Bill? Or anyone else? Yeah. Okay, great. Any other problem with this definition that people might have? You can chat it in or talk it in. Well, in the interest of time, what I'll share is that some of us are concerned that subjectivity is not baked into this particular definition. So what I experience as a trauma, you all very well might not. And this definition doesn't account for that potential variation in the experience of traumatic events or situations. So many of us prefer this particular working definition of potential traumas that's been advanced by SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. They do a lot of good work in this space and have over the course of the last 2 decades. They argue that individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances. So right away, they account for this problem that Bill hinted at, which is that, well, trauma might be a set of circumstances like poverty, like historical trauma, et cetera, et cetera. Not that there isn't acute trauma built into that, but sometimes there isn't, and it's just this kind of chronic, lower level experience of adversity that really is traumatic in nature, and this definition acknowledges that. This definition also says it's an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as, meaning that I have to experience this individual as something. So it's individuality, subjectivity is a part of this definition, which many of us are thankful for, because it directs us to this notion that everybody experiences events and traumas perhaps differently, and we want to understand when we're working with them, how do they experience that? It really helps to think about someone's subjective response, individualized response. But it's experienced as not just physically harmful, but it can also be emotionally harmful, to address one of the limitations we identified earlier. And it's going to have lasting effects. So this part, that first part of the definition, right here, I'm pointing. Whoops, I'm pointing to it with my fingers. If you could see me, you can't. This first part of the definition helps to expand the notion of potential traumas. But the second part of this definition lets us know that the experience is going to have a lasting adverse effect on any one or combination of a number of domains of functioning. So it's not any old experience. It's something that's going to be very consequential. So let's dig into that a little bit. There is a large category that's helpful to understand to distinguish between various types of trauma, and that's the category of simple versus complex, or type 1 versus type 2 trauma. It's helpful to know it just briefly. Type 1 trauma is a single incident experience of adversity or overwhelm, like a car accident, being a victim of a violent crime, being exposed to a natural disaster, what have you. And what's really interesting about these types of experiences, these single incident traumas, is that as a species, we tend to be resilient to these experiences. We recover from them through our own naturalistic resilient processes. Sometimes even we can experience growth in the aftermath of trauma exposure, and that's referred to as oh my gosh, why am I blanking on it? Post-traumatic growth, excuse me, PTG. So that's type 1 trauma. Happens in childhood or adulthood. More likely in adulthood because adults can extricate themselves from difficult life experiences where children can't. And so children and sometimes vulnerable adults, tend to be exposed to what we refer to as type 2 traumas or multi-incident traumas. These are often prolonged or enduring, overwhelming negative experiences that take place usually in the context of social exploitation. So like child abuse and neglect, that is a very typical type 2 trauma. Like intimate partner violence, it's usually not just one incident. It takes place, it's a recurring experience that takes place over the course of time. These types of traumas are sometimes referred to as complex because they're complex both in how they arise and they're complex in terms of what they imply, what sort of consequences emerge in the aftermath of these types of experiences. If it takes place in childhood, sometimes we refer to this as complex developmental trauma or CDT. And I would argue it's these types of traumas that those of us who serve vulnerable adults, families, and or children, which I suspect that describes your client base, I would argue that this is the type of trauma that we see in our agencies, in our services, in our volunteer or professional services, is type 2 trauma. If we're serving vulnerable communities, families, and children, there is a strong possibility or probability that someone or some people in this family or this adult has been exposed to significant trauma inside or outside the household at some point over the course of their lives, and that it has been a relatively meaningful and consequential experience for that person or set of experiences. We know, for instance, that people who hail from low-income communities or households have experienced significant adversity and trauma, even just in childhood, at the rate of 85%. 85%. 18.5 out of 20. Is that right? I think so. 19 out of 20. Yeah. No, that's not right. 85%. And over 40% of people from low-income communities experience 4 or more different types of significant traumatic experiences as children, what we sometimes refer to as adverse childhood experiences. So I'm trying to make the point that if we define trauma in the more expansive, probably the more face valid way, like we did in that previous slide, and then we, in all likelihood, can recognize trauma in a large majority of clients or people that reside in low-income neighborhoods. I hope that makes sense. Any questions so far? Comments? Madison, we doing okay? No comments, questions?
Looks like we're doing good. Feel free to use the raise your hand icon too.
Great. Okay, so we kind of understand the definition of trauma. We recognize that it's very common amongst the community at large. 66% of the community at large experiences at least one significant adversity just in childhood alone. Over 70% significant adversity or trauma lifetime. But when we're talking about low-income communities, it's really trauma and adversity really concentrated within low-income communities, unfortunately. We live in a stratified world and stratified society. So the next question becomes, well, what do we expect to see in the aftermath of trauma exposure amongst children and adults? And there are three what are sometimes often referred to as primary symptoms of trauma exposure, primary consequences. Checking on the time here. And these lead or leach or bleed into other more long-term kinds of experiences of trauma exposure. So the initial experiences include the following. One, re-experiencing or intrusions, excuse me. What is that? It's just that in the aftermath of a trauma exposure, I'm going to be thinking about that experience time and time and time again, even when I don't want to. I'll be thinking about it because there's a reminder in my environment, or I'll think about it just because it just surfaces in my mind. I don't have a lot of control. It's this particular symptom criterion is considered or oftentimes reported as the most frustrating or difficult, intolerable one, because one, it's uncontrollable, and two, it's not very pleasant. Just arises when it wants to, and it reminds me of something terrible. So then I engage in what we refer to as avoidance, or a second symptom criteria of trauma exposure, second common reaction, another way of saying it. And I start to avoid people, places, or things that remind me of the trauma because I don't want to go into that re-experiencing state. I also start to avoid my memories of the trauma. And I can do that through any number of mechanisms that are quite effective in the short term, but not so helpful in the long term, perhaps, like suppression or repression, and like some form of compulsive or obsessive behavior that does a good job of helping me avoid my current mind state, like substance misuse or compulsive gambling or what have you. So that's avoidance. And we do know that addictive behaviors, not with everybody, but with some, can trace its roots back to trauma exposure. There's a probabilistic relationship between trauma exposure and addictive behaviors. And then there's a third symptom criteria referred to as hyperarousal, sometimes called hypervigilance. And what is that? Does anybody know what that is? So I'll gather my breath here for a second. Well, again, in the interest of time, it means that I'm always on alert for threat. I'm always ready for the next shoe to drop. I'm always scanning my environment for danger and responding to danger in a way that is self-protective. And oftentimes it leads to an over-appraisal of danger because I'm so conditioned to think that I'm always at risk, that hyperarousal symptom really, it just enervates me. It just kind of drains me of my energy. But two, it also prevents me from enjoying experiences that are actually really quite safe and positive and inspiring. But instead, I'm interpreting threat all the time, even when it's not there. So I'm conditioned to just over-interpret threat. That's what that means. Now, we know that those are the kind of the shorter term primary symptoms of trauma exposure. But then there are longer term symptoms of trauma exposure, like, for instance, mental health related challenges, depression, anxiety, even personality disorder. But it's obvious how depression can arise. I have all this negative material, all these negative thoughts and memories that tend to surface in my mind, and I don't have control over them. Well, that can really bum me out. It just leads to a dysthymic or depressed mood state. It's obvious how anxiety could arise. I'm always on alert for threat. I don't feel safe. I feel as if instead what I have to do in order to protect myself is constantly scan my environment for danger. Well, that can wear the system down and can actually evolve into full-blown clinical anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder. So a lot of mental health related challenges are related to, and it's obvious that PTSD can become full-blown. What I just described are some of these re-experiencing, avoidance, and hyperarousal are PTSD primary symptoms, but they don't necessarily have to be full-blown. But they could, if they don't abate, if there aren't corrective experiences over time, they could become full-blown. So depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other mental health related disorders are clearly linked, at least in a probabilistic manner, to trauma exposure. As I mentioned earlier, so are behavioral health problems like substance use disorders linked to trauma exposure, because there's something called self-medication theory. If I've experienced a lot of trauma, then I'm going to likely want to try to numb my memories, my feelings, etc., to those experiences because they're not very pleasant. There are even physical health correlates of trauma exposure, consequences of trauma exposure. Why would my physical health be at risk if I've been exposed to a lot of trauma over the course of my life? Anyone know? Anyone have an idea? I'm going to wait you out on this one.
Well, I'm going to say there are certain chemicals.
Excellent.
I'm not quite. I only know one, cortisol, and then I could probably look them up. But
who's the?
This is Lois.
Lois, spot on, Lois. Thank you. Yeah. So when I scan my environment for threat, and then I actually think I'm seeing threat, and I move into a self-protective mode, fight or flight or freeze mode, I'm actually, my system is activating a cascade, a neurobiological cascade that includes a number of different hormones, such as cortisol, that puts my system on alert. And what it tends to do is it increases my heart rate. It depresses my immune system. I don't want my energy going to my immune system. I want my energy going to more immediate threats in the physical world. So it might increase my heart rate, depress my immune system, have other sorts of implications for my organ system. And it really puts a lot of wear and tear on my organ and body system as a whole. And so it could ultimately erode or corrode my health over time. And there are good studies to suggest that that is exactly what happens. So excellent point. Not to mention if I'm engaging in substance misuse, that'll have a corrosive effect as well.
Looks like we have a couple other answers in the chat. Somebody else saying stress hormones, which we kind of talked about here, and then also affecting your ability to sleep.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because I'm hyped up. Hyperarousal, I'm always on alert for threat. I can't turn that off. That's a great comment. I can't turn that off. In fact, one of the symptoms of hyperarousal is inability to fall asleep. Well, we all know how important sleep is. It's one of the most critical factors, unitive critical factors for our health. And if I'm experiencing hyperarousal at a significant level, I'm going to have a really hard time sleeping. That's a really great point. Beautiful, beautiful. So educational attainment tends to be affected also by trauma exposure. Why? What's that about? Well, there's an interesting story here. If I've been exposed to a lot of adversity as a child or youth, my mind, again, is conditioned to scan my environment for threat, including my classroom environment. And it's not as if I have a lot of control over this tendency. It's a very primitive, powerful, instinctive part of the brain that initiates my threat detection and threat response system. And so that system is always being sort of initiated or startled or often, but particularly in social settings. What are we going to do? What happens to a kid who's experienced a lot of adversity, a lot of trauma? We put him in a classroom in the Milwaukee public school system that has 30 or 40, gosh forbid, 50 other students. And I've heard classrooms actually sort of expand to that size. And many of whom themselves have experienced significant adversity. And we're asking that kid to pay attention to the teacher who's giving the math, reading, or writing lesson of the day. And we're asking them to do that day in and day out. Well, what's going to happen is a lot of times in the classroom, that kid's system is going to try to pay attention to the teacher, but instead his threat response mechanisms are going to hijack higher order mechanisms such that he can't pay attention to the teacher, but instead, or she can't pay attention to the teacher, but instead is paying attention to what's going on with my peers, because this is where the threat lies. The threat for my physical or psychological safety lies with my peers. I can't pay attention to the teacher. We label that child ADHD or ADD, attention deficit, but in reality, what really is happening, could be anyway, is the consequences of trauma exposure. And there's pretty good literature, pretty good research to suggest that trauma symptoms, complex trauma symptoms amongst children is underdiagnosed at the expense of attention deficit disorder. Does that make sense? I hope that made sense. That's a story that should be relatively straightforward. And so that kid's not really getting the lessons of the day. That child instead is just really trying to survive in the midst of their peer group And not through any fault of their own necessarily. Their mind just really won't allow them to absorb what's happening with the lessons of the day. And that child is at risk for low educational attainment. We also know that yeah.
Not to put you on the spot, but just out of curiosity, do you have any data in your research or other people's that has linked those traumas to the dropout rates in Milwaukee?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Now, I don't know, not in Milwaukee necessarily, but in, for instance, I've done some research. I've done some research in Chicago that shows that, yes, trauma exposure is probabilistically linked to dropout rates. Whenever we talk about phenomena as complex as dropping out of high school, other social phenomena, we're talking about probabilistic relationships. In other words, if I've been exposed to child abuse and neglect as a youngster, my likelihood of dropping out of high school is increased. It's not for sure going to happen, but it's increased. So yes, the answer is yes. I've seen research and done research, not in Milwaukee, but outside of Milwaukee. And maybe there's been research in Milwaukee, but I haven't seen it. But I can't imagine why it's not generalizable to Milwaukee, why the results I just mentioned aren't generalizable to Milwaukee. We also know that was that Madison?
Yes, and we have Carol asking if we see this similar effect on education for adults or adults seeking service.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. These effects would extend into adulthood. I haven't seen any of those data, but I can't. Well, I've seen, yes, they extend into, yeah, beyond 18. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because again, the mind, I'm still carrying that same mind with me, which is conditioned to detect and respond to threat. And I have a heck of a time enlisting my higher order attention regulation functions. Those are higher order functions. They require will. They require what we refer to as down regulation skills. And these are, in other words, just kind of quiet my mind skills. And it's very difficult for me to do that because particularly lower parts of my brain, real primitive, hard to reach parts of my brain are just incredibly active, making sure I'm okay. Good questions, good comments, thank you. Okay, so what do we do? Let's talk briefly about trauma responsive services, excuse me. Talk briefly about trauma response. So if this is the profile of our consumer population, client population, whatever the population of interest, group of interest, whatever the terminology is, I don't mean to offend anybody. I just use some shorthand. But if this is the kind of the profile or presentation of those whom we serve, what should I do as an interventionist? There are a few very broad-based suggestions to inform my services on the ground so that they can be trauma responsive. They can increase the probability that they will be effective for trauma affected people. And these principles include the following. I want services that are structured. And I'm able to communicate that structure to my clients. We're going to do this, 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 and this, and we're going to stay on task. And so they're also relatively focused. I'm serving to some extent as a co-attention regulator because I may be working with someone who has a difficult time regulating their attention. So I'm helping them regulate their attention through structure, through communication of that structure, and through focus. And the focus is oftentimes external. When I work with people who have been trauma affected, I like to have whatever we're working on to be external. It's like a piece of paper or it's a video we're talking about. I don't want them to stay solely in their heads. I want them to externalize their thoughts to the extent that they can with the help of a sheet of paper, an assessment that we're completing, an activity we're completing that uses their hands, whatever. That can be really, really useful for people who've experienced a lot of adversity. It helps them, it helps them overcome that inattention issue, which has something to do with just scanning for threat on the basic sort of non-pre-verbal level. And not only do I want to be a co-regulator for attention, I want to be a regulator, for emotions. So when I'm working with trauma-affected children, youth, or young adults, I work with young adults, not older adults usually. I prepare for my sessions such that I feel like I try to get myself into a centered space I have a very dear, I have a meditation practice that is very dear to me. I might just for a few moments engage in that practice prior to seeing my client or my charge, because I want to make sure that I'm promoting and exuding a certain kind of calm, which will help them, at least at the emotional level, potentially remain more calm. I'm a co-regulator, if you will. I want to focus on skill building. One of the hallmarks of trauma, not only that it undermines regulatory abilities, but it undermines just general skills. Whether that be, my ability to manage my emotions and attention, my ability to read well, my ability to do math, to follow an instructor's advice, leader's instruction, what have you. So I'm really working on concrete skill building. That's why I really love the work that you guys do, because it's a win. It's externally focused, and it's skill based in nature. So I think it could be very helpful for trauma affected individuals. And I always keep, yeah, please.
We have another question from Bianca. So we heard that you meditate sometimes to set your place before a session with a client or a student. But do you ever meditate with students or teach those practices to your students?
I often do at the end of the session. If we've talked about trauma, I'll do it at the end. It depends on the context. If I'm doing clinical work, yes. And we'll do it at the end of the session, or we'll to maintain a sense of calm, and it'll be homework. So if I'm doing clinical work, the answer is yes. If I'm doing not more direct service, that's not clinical work, then I'm less inclined, because I just don't have that kind of ongoing connection with someone. But if you have an ongoing connection with someone and you think and you have the skills to teach, it's a wonderful way of helping people develop attention regulation skills. So yes, it's great. Good question. Thank you. And referral. Thanks for jumping in there, Madison. You're good. And referral. It's because people have experienced a lot of adversity. They've that adversity cascades is the word that's often used. Cascades into a number of different domains of function. We've looked at it: mental health, educational attainment, even employment, relationship skills, etc. So it might be really helpful if you end up learning that someone has these various problems, or that they've been these various maybe deficits, or that's not the best term, but they're facing some of these challenges, and they've been exposed to a lot of adversity. Be great to have some referral networks. I don't know if you have referral networks. I suspect you do, but when working with trauma affected clients, it's really helpful to have a community of providers, formal or informal, supporting that person's skill development and even recovery from trauma exposure. Okay, any questions, any additional comments or questions, Madison? Okay.
Not see, oh, wait, we have one other comment in the box here from Patricia. Is a person who has experienced trauma better or less able to be a co-regulator, or does it not make a difference because of their similar experience? So someone who has also experienced trauma, will they have a more difficult time being a co-regulator?
In my estimation, the answer is it depends. It depends on, I'll use myself as an example. If I've been exposed to significant adversity throughout the course of my life, various times, and if I'm not so conscious of that experience, I'm going to be less effective within a one-on-one or direct service context. Maybe my client will bring up issues that trigger me, and then I'm not able to co-regulate as well as I would like, et cetera. But if I've been exposed to adversity, and I have, and I'm somewhat aware of that, I don't have to be perfectly aware of everything, and I've done, a fair amount of sincere work to overcome the effects of those experiences through various approaches, whatever they may be, my own counseling, my own meditation practice, and other sort of wellness practices, then there's a chance that I could relate to that person even more deeply and could be a co-regulator or positive influence in their life even sort of more effectively. So in my estimation, it depends on my level of self-knowledge and self-awareness. I think trauma exposure can be actually a a positive asset for an interventionist if they have some purchase on it, if they have some awareness of it and have done some work to become sort of grounded in the face of that history, somewhat resolved in the face of that history. So that's how I would answer that question. It's sort of, it depends. And I know that's not maybe the most satisfying answer, but I think it's a true answer. It's true to my personal and professional experience.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, it's 1:08. I've taken 38 minutes to get to the topic of the day, but I think it's necessary to talk about these other issues in order to set up the conversation about secondary trauma or secondary traumatization. Secondary traumatization is the process of experiencing secondary trauma and what happens afterwards. So what is it? Secondary traumatization, it's the transformation of my inner experience, the inner experience of a practitioner, that comes about as a result of empathic engagement with clients or clients' trauma material. So read that again. If I'm experiencing secondary trauma or secondary traumatization, what's going on is something's changing within me. My thoughts, my feelings, my emotions, my feelings, something's changing within me, my inner experience. And it's changing because I'm engaging with someone who's been exposed to a lot of trauma. So it's almost as if their trauma exposure is now resulting in my trauma symptoms. That's what secondary trauma or secondary traumatization is all about. I'm working with someone who's been exposed to adversity, and usually it's someone, as the bottom point mentions here, usually I'm more apt to experience secondary traumatization if I'm working with someone who's had type 2, not type 1 trauma. And I suspect that you all work with a lot of people who've experienced type 2, or what we refer to as multi-incident recurrent trauma, as opposed to just single incident acute trauma. I'm more apt to experience this transformation of my inner experience if I'm working with someone who has type 2 trauma. And what's gonna happen is I'll develop my own symptoms or consequences of trauma exposure. And this can happen even if somebody isn't telling me about their trauma exposure, but I'm working with them and it's in the room. Now, it's more likely to happen if they tell me about their trauma exposure, but even if the material is just implicit, even if their memories are yet to be disclosed, they're presenting as a trauma, perhaps as a trauma survivor, and I can feel that, I can sense that. And so I'm at risk for developing my own trauma consequences. Now, don't think of this as sort of suspend disbelief. Don't think of this as a mental health diagnosis. It's not. It's not. It's just having some natural reactions to clients' trauma material or trauma histories. What kinds of reactions can I have? Well, I can engage in, or I can experience intrusive thoughts or re-experiencing. In other words, I think about my client again and again and again when I don't want to. Maybe I think about some stories that they've told me or some of the suffering that they've shared with me or just about their life circumstance, and I can't freaking get it out of my mind. It's an intrusive thought. Or I start to avoid reminders of my clients or my clients' trauma material. I might even start to avoid some clients. When I was young in the field, I did a lot of phone counseling, and so my clients would call me in between our formal sessions. And there was one time when there was a client that I avoided because his trauma material was just overwhelming to me, and I had to learn how to overcome that tendency of avoidance. Maybe I'm hyper aroused. I'm always on edge now because I'm learning more and more about how my city works, or I'm thinking a lot about this person's experience, and I'm starting to become a little less trusting, a little bit more on edge, just at a base physiological level. These are not uncommon responses to working in the direct practice context. It doesn't mean I'm mentally ill. It just means I'm having natural reactions to working with trauma affected individuals. The symptoms or experiences or consequences of secondary trauma can extend also into a little bit more kind of cognitive and emotional realms. So for instance, I can start to have disruptions in my cognitive schema about the world or about myself. So I might start to think that, for instance, that the world is a lot less rosy than I used to think. It's a lot less safe than I used to think. It's a lot less attractive and alluring and exciting than I used to think. It's full of a lot of danger and ugliness. When I hear about or I catch wind of how people might treat one another, or how policies affect people, or what have you. I might start experiencing sort of some alterations in my mood state. Maybe I tend toward depression or anxiety, and I start to feel more of that. I'm a little bit off balance because I'm interacting with people who have had a lot of suffering. Maybe I start to have alterations in my meaning making, existential crises, for instance. Like this happened to me. I was working with a lot of trauma affected clients when I was a full-time clinician, and early in my career, and some people were successful, some weren't. Trauma is a difficult, particularly complex trauma is a difficult experience to recover from and overcome. And so I started to doubt not them, but myself. Like, am I really cut out for this work? Well, I love this work. And I've come to just love it over the course of my life. But initially, sometimes there were some existential questions about whether or not I was cut out for it. And that's a common symptom or response that is that reflects secondary traumatization. And then maybe I'm having some challenges in my relationship because my mood and my thoughts are all scrambled, and I'm starting to kind of isolate a little bit more, or cut off from my relationships, or maybe I'm clinging or merging too much with my relationships. Does that make sense? And does anybody have any questions about this secondary trauma? And again, try to suspend disbelief. Try to see yourself in any of these common responses to working with a difficult quote unquote service base. Do we think about our clients sometimes too often we want to stop? Do I feel a little bit off base, a little sad because I know what people are experiencing in my community?
I see a question here.
Yeah.
Would you like to go ahead?
Can you just quickly say the difference between a disturbance of cognitive schema and existential crisis?
They're not that different, but a cognitive schema, we think more about like what is my sense of the world? Is it safe? What is my sense of myself? Am I safe in this world? So that has some existential kind of leaning to it, but existential is a little bit more. These are very cognitive schema are very base. They have to do with worth, safety, love. But existential has to do more with like the future. Am I really cut out for this work? What am I going to do with my life, knowing now that the world is really unsafe and I have to protect myself a little bit more? I can ask some questions about what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to humanity? What's going to happen to our nation? Is this how we treat one another? What's going to happen to my city? Is this what's going on in certain parts of my city? Holy smokes. Do I really want to stay here? Should I help more? Should I help less? I start to really question the future and my role in my future when I'm thinking about existential crises. So they're not totally distinct. There's some overlap there, but that's how I make sense of those. The bottom line is that I'm starting to get shaken at the emotional level, but also at the cognitive level, the level of belief, the level of future orientation. I'm starting to get shaken because trauma is no joke, suffering's no joke. And the people that I work with in various contexts, whether it's child welfare services or what have you, home visiting services, these people experience a lot of adversity. W-2 services, I work in those different contexts. And the clients that we serve, the consumers that we serve, a lot of adversity. I've heard many, many stories about intimate partner violence, childhood sexual abuse. They're horrific stories. And these shake me. They shake me to my root. And they can affect my emotions and my beliefs about the world and my thoughts about my future, my thoughts about my city's future, et cetera.
I think a lot of us can relate to these feelings, and we definitely see it with burnout in our industry and nonprofit and direct service work. So I don't know if you're about to touch on this, but I'd love to hear if there's some ways of prevention or coping.
Exactly. So it's 1:17. So this is really great. I've depressed the heck out of all of us. So now, what the heck? I'll never be asked back again. But so the question now becomes, well, what do we do? What should we do? So let's land on solutions. That's where we want to end. And I know we only have 3 to 13 minutes left, but let's land on solutions. The first thing I think we want to note, the first principle that's important, the first solution that I think is helpful is to recognize that secondary trauma is to some extent inevitable. The question shouldn't be, well, am I going to react negatively to suffering amongst those I'm trying to serve, those I'm empathically engaged with? No, I don't think that should be the question. I think we should recognize or anticipate that we're going to have negative responses, difficult responses to suffering amongst those we're serving, suffering amongst those we care about. That's just human nature, and we're caring people. That's why we're doing this work. So I want to recognize first and foremost that it's inevitable that I'm going to experience secondary trauma. And the question then becomes, how do I respond to it? Not how do I keep it from happening? How do I prevent it? How instead do I respond to it? How do I engage instead in post-secondary traumatic growth? We're not going to talk about that term eudaimonia, but how do I engage in post-secondary traumatic growth so that once I experience secondary trauma, how do I grow from it? We don't need to talk, well, very briefly, there's a distinction between burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary trauma. These are oftentimes referred to as the costs of caring. Burnout is just, I'm trying to fulfill the demands of my job, and I'm exhausted because the demands are so high and I can't seem to realize my personal and professional goals in my work. Compassion fatigue is a little bit more specific, meaning that the demands of my job require that I reinvigorate or revitalize my compassion on a day-to-day basis, and my work, whether it's overwhelming or not, it's just outstripping my restorative powers. I can't continue to reinvoke my compassion. Secondary trauma is even more specific. It has to do with working with traumatized clients and then experiencing my own symptoms of trauma. Let's not talk about that. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about what helps, because that's where we want to land. So what helps? It really helps to work in a teaming consultation supervisory context so that I can talk about my cases with my supervisor, with my peers, in formal and informal ways, and I don't feel like I'm alone. If I feel like I'm alone doing this direct practice work with people that are suffering significantly, I can get overwhelmed pretty easily. And what I talk about is two different sort of domains. I talk about, okay, what's going on with this case and how can I best help them? Can I get some ideas? I have some ideas. It'd be great to hear what others think or what you think about my ideas, get some feedback. That's instrumental support, but it's also sometimes helpful to get reflective or emotional support. Like, oh man, working with Johnny is just tough, man. The kid, he experiences a lot of adversity. I care about him and I just feel really sad. And I just wanted to share that I love this kid, you know, on a professional level. And I'm saddened and sometimes torn up at what I know he has to deal with on a daily basis. And just having someone hear that can be really helpful. I don't need anybody to say anything, just to hear that. So instrumental or affective or reflective emotional support can be useful. It's also helpful to have professional development experiences like this and like the trainings that you are all participating in. I really give Madison and the Literacy Center a ton of credit for providing these types of professional development opportunities. Research shows that that tends to improve not only my services, but my experience of secondary trauma. What else helps? Well, it's helpful to know that what I'm seeing is trauma and its effects. Because I know then that I can invoke this framework. Well, where'd it go? This framework. There are some principles that can help inform what I do with this client that will help my services improve the nature of my services. And then I know what I'm seeing. Where'd it go? Yeah, I know what I'm seeing then. I have a framework for understanding what I'm seeing. This guy's attention is he just can't stay focused. His emotions are all over the place. It very well may have something to do with a stressful life and the experiences of trauma that he's experienced or that he's encountered in the past. It's helpful to know that. And now I'm going to use my trauma responsive framework to strengthen my services, to increase the effectiveness of my services. It also helps, and this is research-based, this one, it also helps, again, to recognize the inevitability of secondary trauma and also the limitations of my services. I can only do so much. I want to focus on what I can do. I want to do it to the best of my ability. I want to pay attention to outcomes. And what I'm doing helping? Do I need to alter what I'm doing in order to improve the outcomes? But I really want to pay attention to process or inputs. Am I doing well? Am I doing what I want, what I need to be doing? I have a hero in the social service world. His name is Father Gregory Boyle. He is a Jesuit priest that started a gang intervention program in Los Angeles County, California. Excuse me. And he's helped countless young adults exit from the crime and gang life because they wanted to and they needed supports. But he's seen a lot of bad outcomes too. He's seen a lot of death. He's seen a lot of return to crime, etc. His program has been shown to be very effective. It's it's probably the kind of gold star of gang intervention programs across the nation. But he's seen a lot of bad outcomes, and he argues that I always have to stay focused on what I'm doing, that I'm doing it well, and on outcomes that aren't always measurable. Like this person feels just more like themselves. They feel like life is more meaningful, etc. I also want to what we refer to as deliver services that are engage, cultivate, curate empathy that is exquisite. And someone defined exquisite empathy as the ability to tune in with my clients, but also the ability to trust, to differentiate from my clients because I trust they have their own path, their own journey, their own resilience, and I have a life that I can go back to that is very satisfying for myself. So I want to repeat that. Exquisite empathy, the ability to be empathic and attuned with my client, but also the ability to know that my client has her own or their own or his own journey. If they believe in one, their own connection to a higher power, whatever my framework might be, they have their own resilience. And I have a life to go back to that is life-giving for me. I bring everything I can to this encounter and then I let it go. And I'm humble. I recognize my role. My place. I like that notion. There's an actual beautiful, we don't have the time, but if anyone's interested, there's a beautiful YouTube video by Brene Brown called Boundaries with Brene Brown. She's a social worker, University of Houston, who's written a lot about vulnerability and boundaries and optimal human functioning from a social work perspective. I think she's excellent. And she's got this beautiful video on why it's critical for me to let go of my clients, to set some limits, because it's only then that I can bring the best of myself back to my work. It's really quite lovely. And then on the individual level, on the personal level, I want to craft a life that is worth living. If I'm working in a direct service space, it's almost incumbent upon me. I almost owe it to my clients in a way to live well. To do the best I can to live well. Actually, engaging in practices that give me energy, strength, joy, a sense of compassion and connection and loving kindness. It's almost a necessity. It's maybe not a necessity, but I would argue it might be a necessity, not only to avoid secondary trauma or transform it into something positive, but also to do good service and to be a good example for my clients. And there are a number of different strategies that are recommended according to the research. And perfect. These include developing different professional roles or volunteer roles for myself. So while I'm working in this context, the literacy center context, in a direct service manner, I might also want to cultivate other roles or skills, like if I'm at the literacy center doing some administrative work, doing some writing. If I'm a volunteer, making sure I'm maybe doing other volunteer work. I've got other areas of my competence that I'm expressing and cultivating. That's been shown to be helpful in transforming secondary trauma. Having my own individual counseling support if I feel the need. Nothing wrong in that. I do that. I have done that, and there's no shame in that. The stigma to that is the stigma of doing that is receding, and the more of us that do it, I think it helps to eradicate that stigma. Obviously, having a strong, meaningful social network outside of my volunteer or professional work is going to strengthen my well-being, so that I can come back to work and give of myself in a helpful and effective way. Research shows that having an active spiritual practice doesn't have to be a formal religious practice, and it doesn't have to be that one doesn't have to do this, but it can be helpful for those who are inclined. Having an active spiritual practice can be useful because it confers a lot of benefits. There's fellowship with other participants in this practice. Oftentimes spirituality imbues a sense of meaning to the world, to life, and to my life. And it oftentimes involves revitalizing routines, rituals, and practices, whatever those might be. The literature also says that mindfulness practice is very helpful for someone who's rendering direct services to trauma-affected people. And I can attest to that. I have a Vipassana practice that I love dearly. I'll pass on embracing complexity. Well, no, I won't. It's important in our day and time. We live in a world, and I think social media, according to pundits that experts that I've read, we live in a world that embraces simplicity, that really approaches difficult problems from simplistic perspectives. Oftentimes takes a binary, lands on binary answers to very complex questions. And that doesn't really reflect very mature thinking, not in all cases, but in many cases it doesn't reflect mature thinking, and it doesn't really honor the complexity of our world, and particularly our social world. So the more I can think about my life and life in general in nuanced and subtle and complex ways that honor the true complexity of life, the better off I am, even as a direct service practitioner trying to transcend ST. I want to cultivate active optimism, not Pollyanna optimism, but realistic optimism. I want to engage in meaning making. I want to make sure that I'm doing what makes sense to me. And not everybody does. These are hard recommendations to follow. There's something, the research suggests that something like only 20% of people love their jobs in our society. So we want to cultivate a life that is meaningful for us. And then we want to engage in active, holistic self-care. I sent out a self-assessment to Madison, and she can circulate to you she can circulate that to you all. It's not meant to be some kind of proper assessment that you complete and hand in to anybody. It's just meant to spur thought about how can I enhance my wellness practices. It's a really cool self-assessment, 2-page document that I like checking in on, and perhaps you might too. So that's all I've got. I know we're at time, 1:30. So if people want to stay and ask additional questions, I'm more than happy to stay. I've got till 2. But those of you who have to go, of course, we understand that. It's been a pleasure speaking with you all. I'll stop sharing my screen, and thank you so much for your attention and your insightful questions.